So a week and a half ago or so, we had a conversation about ChatGPT and AI and the future of work and like Marxism. We're going to try and now recreate that conversation in a totally artificial way because we didn't record it the first time. But this, so
but it will be just as spontaneous and insightful and illuminating as it was the first time.
That's the hope.
Okay.
So I'm going to start off with the sort of overview of what I said to start the conversation, and sort of hope that that kind of takes us in the same general way. So what I said was, holy fucking crap, ChatGPT. I've been saying that for a couple of weeks. Lots of things to say about it, but the thing I said to you was, this seems like a white collar human being to me. It has the same capability. So the example I gave was general practitioner medicine, taking in input, spoken language from humans, going through algorithms and coming out with treatments and referrals and stuff to specialists. Like a robot is going to be better at that, if not today, then very, very soon than a human ever will. So like really high level algorithmic human stuff that this machine is going to be better at. What I said to you, and this is totally wrong, but I'm going to say it again anyway, that seems to me like it drives the cost of white-collar human labor to zero. And you said, no, that's totally wrong, and here's why. So go forward from there.
So my context as someone within an academic setting is that everyone has been saying, holy fucking shit about ChatGPT for a couple months in this context, but I have largely been ignoring them because they've been thinking of it, and I don't want to reduce this too simply because I think some people are thinking about it in really thoughtful ways. But the first response to ChatGPT when the press went nuts over it is that students will plagiarize their papers with it. And so the academic conversation has been about that. And of course, they will plagiarize their papers with it, but they've plagiarized their papers with a whole set of other tools for a very long period of time. And if you teach at a place where I do, students actually have access to paying a human to plagiarize their paper, and ChatGPT won't do that better. So this is not a paradigm change. It is just a different tool, and there will be a different set of responses. So I have been somewhat blasé in my responses to those folks. You have also been saying for a couple of months, oh my fucking God, this is significant. And I have been listening to you in a different way because that's a very different context in which you're saying it. And so this conversation about the future of work and the meaning of ChatGPT for labor and profit and capitalism comes from that background of, I can see, because you have said you see it, the major transformations that this would have in that context. So the thing that I was responding to you on text where I said, no, it's not that thing, is a broader dominant narrative out there that was particularly big around Andrew Yang's presidential campaign, where he was pushing a line that has been around for a very long time, but has really flourished in the last, 5 or 8 years. And that is the notion that we're finally reaching the moment where technology is going to replace humans for real, because now it's not just a tool that humans use to speed up the things that they do in various labor practices. Now we can simply take a human, remove them, and replace them with some form of AI, some form of machine learning, or maybe even a robot entity that is running on AI, and we will get rid of them. And Yang's presidential campaign, the book he wrote, people got really excited about it because it seems so compelling, because the world is falling apart in all sorts of ways. At that moment in time, people were even more convinced that it was falling apart in terms of the economy. And so saying, well, this is driven by technology. And the Silicon Valley mindset also does this. Technology is the prime driver. And this is what's happening now. And all the jobs are going away. So we're really in trouble. And we need a leader like Yang who knows what to do in the face of that. As a student of capitalism, that is someone who's been trying to understand capitalism and the history of people trying to understand capitalism, I feel like I know and can say confidently that basic thesis is total bullshit. That since capitalism, probably since the inception of capitalism, but definitely, which we can roughly say is maybe sometime in the 17th century, but maybe we want to even say it goes back to the 14th century. But let's just say early 19th century. Since the early 19th century, a massive industrialized transformation, say particularly starting in Great Britain in the early 19th century, we have seen technology make it possible to eliminate jobs on an unbelievable scale. So the thing that we talked about was the cloth industry in England in the early part of the 19th century, where we went from sewing things by hand on a hand loom to these machine looms. And I've not looked up this data recently. I looked it up a while ago and looked at it all and marked it down. But the scale is mind-blowing, because what a machine loom was able to do, and over about 20 years of improvements of the machine loom, it was like first it replaced 3 workers, then it replaced 50 workers, then it replaced 1,200 workers, then it replaced 15,000 workers. It produces so much cloth, it is unbelievable. So my response to your text message about I think there's 2 levels of this. One is about how we understand cost of labor. The first one is the really simple level, which is this going to take away people's jobs? And I simply said no, because in the history of capitalism, technological changes and competitive pressures among firms are constantly eliminating a bunch of jobs over here and creating a bunch of jobs over here. And individuals and sectors of society get totally screwed over. And if you were a person who sewed cloth by hand in the early 19th century, you lost your job. And it is probably the case that at some point, whether it's 5 years from now or 15 years from now, people who are long-haul truckers will lose their jobs, just as coal miners have been losing their jobs. And we should, of course, think about those things from a policy perspective, and we should be concerned and empathetic for those individuals. But what someone like Andrew Yang is doing is not saying we should have a policy in place that worries about the displacement as jobs basically move around in an economy. He's saying all these jobs are going to go away. That is just nonsense. And there's both a left and a right perspective on it, where we're just supposed to use this great technology and it will somehow produce everything we need and we will go from there. So the first thing I was doing is saying that's just not how capitalism has ever worked. Maybe there's a future where we get rid of capitalism, but I think what you and I are kind of doing in this conversation today is saying, let's play this out, assuming we don't get rid of capitalism. So there's a separate set of conversations where we say, what if we made social, political, legal changes across multiple countries in which we altered the foundation for our economic mode of production and therefore made it so we had a mode that was not capitalist? All sorts of hypotheticals could come from that. But for our starting point, I think we're just going to say, well, what if basically we still keep making commodities that we sell for profit in a competitive environment, et cetera? That was the starting point. And my first answer was, whatever ChatGPT is, we want to be wary of the Andrew Yangs of the world, because the really simple narrative about ChatGPT is the robots are coming for our jobs. And so we should be scared or freaked out and stop it or something like that, because it's going to take all our jobs. I'm actually open to the possibility that it is going to be a major social political transformation, but not because it takes away all of our jobs.
And come back to your point about capitalism. Like, there got to be something that you can exploit for you to produce value. It's like, you can't exploit the robots. The robots cost what they cost. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, because I think that's the real sort of that's the place where you can come at this basic issue, and that's where it splits into 2 different complete paths of what you're thinking about. And so the thing that I think you put it in a language that was really helpful for me to respond to clarify is, you said basically this is going to make it so that we can reduce the cost of labor. Right? We're going to be able to pay humans so much less because ChatGPT is going to be able to write bullshit inter-office memos or things like that. Those are kind of the bullshit jobs. Or maybe do super important things like make first-level diagnosis in medical practices, where we now need to pay someone who doesn't do a bullshit job. They do a very hard job, but if we can access big data and machine learning, it turns out that even though that person is incredibly skilled and incredibly competent, maybe that's something that the AI does better. And the key there is that if we have to kind of step back from this particular technology and ask ourselves how capitalist goods get produced. And what I did there was boil that down into something very, very crude, but accurate at that level, which is that we have 2 basic inputs to a capitalist production process. Marx calls them constant capital and variable capital, but they are basically, on the one hand, all of the materials and resources, seeds when we're growing things, lumber when we're building houses, all of that material, but also all of the tools, all of the buildings, These are all some version of constant capital. And then we have over here variable capital, which is just another name for human laboring practices. You have to have a human and they come in and do stuff in relation to this environment. And your initial thought was, well, the way we think about ChatGPT and the way people have been writing about it is that it's trying to replicate what humans do. So it would make it, and if I had ChatGPT instead of a person I'm paying a wage in either a quality job or a bullshit job, and I have ChatGPT, your thought was, well, that just got a whole lot cheaper because the ChatGPT is, let's say they call it $10 a month, and I can have an instance of it running here who's being my administrator, as opposed to hiring an administrator for an annual salary that whatever it is much higher than $10 a month. And your thought was, well, human labor costs just got really, really cheap. And the key point that changes things is that under capitalism, it won't work that way, because what makes variable capital is not the humanness of it. Like, let's just imagine for a second that we shoot into the future and our 8th generation ChatGPT is mind-blowingly brilliant as an android in a robotic device, and we can't even tell that this creature is not human, that what it does in its work is clearly superior to 98% of the humans that we would hire. That competence wouldn't change the basic fact that when I hire a human, and this is the key, I think, when I hire a human, what I pay them ultimately comes down to they need to get a wage from me that helps them feed, clothe, and shelter themselves. But they go off after they work and take the wage and feed, clothe, and shelter themselves. When I buy framing lumber to build a house or a tool to assemble sheet metal, I pay the market price to someone else who has produced that as a commodity. I don't pay them wages daily. I buy the thing once. In accounting practices, I may depreciate the building so that there's a weekly and annual cost for it, in the same way I have monthly labor costs. But the difference is that I buy the thing and own it in full versus you come to me, we agree on a wage, I pay you the wage for the week, the month, the year, you go away. And so as long as we're assuming that our robot or our ChatGPT is something that OpenAI has created and then can charge us for, then it is going to be this constant capital. It is going to be a machine. The other scenario is that the robots fight for their political rights and get the right to live autonomous lives outside of laboring for us. Then maybe they look like humans. But as long as we're not at that point, what we are doing is an input into our production process is we have to have ChatGPT over here with all the other constant capital. And this is where the calculations for how capitalism works changes what things look like. Because when ChatGPT is over here with a thing that we buy on the market, then we here are capitalists, because we're trying to understand how capital's production process works. We pay the market rate. And we can't buy a machine that itself generates extra value or profit for us. We can buy a machine that makes our production process more efficient. So as long as there's profit out there to be gained, it can help us in that. But all of our competitors are doing the same thing. If we had a machine that you paid $10 for and it produced $11 worth of profit, then everybody would buy the machine until it cost $10.99. And if that was the only way we generated profit, so if we had this, we were just like, nope, no one will work. We have the best machines ever and we will buy the machines. You cannot have capitalism that way. We have to have this thing over here, because the key difference with the variable capital, the human labor, is that what you pay is enough for those people to go live. What you get is the result of their laboring. And there is a gap between those two. And that is surplus value. That is the thing that makes profit possible. And that is the thing that makes capitalism work to the extent that capitalism works. So that is the kind of really quickly dense framework of right now, for me, it only makes sense to think about ChatGPT as a machine. And if it's a machine, it's not replacing humans. It's making humans' labor more productive, which would mean that maybe we have twice as many bullshit jobs because we need far more humans. So we kind of take some of our profit and hire them to do not very much, to like sit there and watch the ChatGPT window do its thing. How does that get to like the rounding out of that framework of what we were talking about?
It totally does. And the only thing I want, first of all, blow my fucking mind every single freaking time when we talk about liberating the robots, because holy shit. Yes, it totally does. The only thing I want to add there is, like, if our prior is capitalism, like we're going to continue capitalism, like you're giving the example of like human adding value to sheet metal to make it more valuable. And the response to that is, oh yes, but you can have a machine that makes the sheet metal that adds value to it. And your response to that is no, but that's a machine at that point. You just buy it. We will find, if we're going to continue capitalism, and this is the thing that exists, and the capitalism is the prior, we will find a way for humans to add value. Like, again, it might be bullshit jobs, or maybe we will find a good way, like to add value to something. Capitalism requires this, so we will have it. We can't think of the example because that's outside our paradigm. You know, we're like something virtual help. I mean, the obvious one that strikes me is, you know, help other humans be more human, be more themselves. Some, you know, some actual thing that's actually value. That'd be great.
Yeah.
That'd be a great capitalism. I wrote down a couple of things while you're talking. That was one of them. The other one that I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss, because it's important to your, you know, your ongoing topic, democracy, is the coal miners. The story about the coal miners. Like, so I asked you, the trigger for that actually was, I asked you, okay, a whole bunch of people who were machine loom workers lost their jobs. What else happened to the society? And that was, I mean, what happened in the world because of this loom? And that was fucking fascinating. So maybe you could do there.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two there. So we'll do kind of the and all of these are just from anyone who pays attention to history or is a historian who listens to this. Oh my God, does this do injustice to the depth and subtlety and complexity of history? So I'm going to combine a whole series of really complicated, subtle histories, but kind of make them into one crude big story. And a future one is to talk about coal miners, but we can talk about the cloth industry, which we earlier talked about. I kind of, you know, I picture factories in and around Manchester, England, where they're bringing to bear these incredibly new, sophisticated machines that make outputs of cloth so much higher. But what we talked about is how that's not a transformation in England. That is a transformation of at least the transatlantic world, and in many ways the broader globe, because the other, we're both talking to one another from opposite coasts in America, thinking about the American context. And in the American context of the 19th century, it's marked by a history of, first, the massive growth and rise in slavery. So slavery marks the American history from very early on. But in the 19th century is where you really have huge numbers of increased slave plantations. The numbers of enslaved people go up dramatically, and the tensions and conflict within the American Republic grow and grow in the beginning of the 19th century, leading to the Civil War. Obviously, that's a very complicated story. In that middle part of the 19th century, the thing to see that I think a lot of Americans don't see in that history is that transformation, the growth of slavery in America in the early 19th century is directly connected to the technological change where we start producing cloth at that scale. Because what the English factories need is the raw materials for that, which is cotton. And so the growth, and then you have the transatlantic slave trade that also includes the enslavement of Africans being taken in the Middle Passage to the Caribbean and the American South, producing cotton under the conditions of slavery that then goes back to those factories. You have the traders and the shippers in Bristol running a slave trade connected to the other side of the Atlantic and Africa, connected to the factories in Manchester, connected to the displaced workers in England. All of that is one connected, massive explosion of capitalist growth in the early part of the 19th century. And it's all interlinked. So we talked about that context, and then I don't remember where we got to it, but it was more like thinking about how the political transformations happen and what this looks like broadly. And then I did a thing, which is what academics do, is we read a bunch of other academics and learn from our students, and we come across things that are brilliant and we figure out ways to condense them and tell the stories as our own. So this story is completely not mine. It's Timothy Mitchell's story in a book called Carbon Democracy, where he basically charts both the rise and fall of democratic revolutions. So the European bourgeois revolutions, but also the French and American revolutions of the late 18th and into the 19th century, the democratic transformations of society, where we get more and more relatively equal. They're still unequal, but they're not as unequal as they used to be. Greater enfranchisement, greater participation, more democratic principles, more liberal protections of human rights. All of those increases that we see in the 19th century. And Mitchell tells a story about it where he says, well, what else is going on there? Well, the major energy source in the beginning of the transformations is power from coal. And if you look at how coal is produced, it happens to be the case that coal is found deep in the seams underground in a few locations. And to get to it is very hard, unbelievably labor intensive. And it has these key choke points. So when the entire growing British economy, and thus in a certain sense, the global capitalist economy, is dependent upon coal as a fuel source, the workers who dig it out of the ground have incredible leverage, because if they stop digging it out, everything breaks. So the relative strength of workers, coal miners, in organizing in that period of time is one of the key drivers, Mitchell argues, for some of these massive transformations toward more democracy. And what he shows is that we then later on switch fuel sources to oil. And oil doesn't work that way. With oil, you can set up pipelines and put it in tankers, and you can move it and make it flow in all sorts of ways. You can dig holes in the ground in all sorts of various places where it shoots up. And it doesn't have those choke points. Labor does not have, just given the nature of the natural resource you're pulling out of the ground, labor does not have the same advantages that it did with coal. And therefore, you can undermine labor protections, you can weaken unions, you don't have this force against the energy source driving global society and global capitalism. So Mitchell's telling a story there that has all sorts of sort of structural resonances with the story I told about early 19th century, the slave trade, cotton plantations, and the growth of the cloth industry. These economic transformations are very much tied to social and political transformations, and it's not in any one single sense. They're mutually reinforcing one another.
Is it because it's dangerous? Right? You're risking your fucking life to go into that. I mean, is that the difference? There were only a few people willing to do it, but they just had tremendous, tremendous power.
And I think my understanding from Mitchell is that it's also just the physical space and size that once you get it set up, and there's also a sort of real technical skill, like that you learn from experience. You have to understand how to make your body go down into a hole and crawl through a tunnel and chip at something with an axe and get coal lung that's probably going to kill you. It's just the sort of thing where it's very hard to get scabs who are going to break the picket line for that in a simplistic sense, right? Once they're there and you have organized, and of course the development of the coal industry goes along with the development of coal workers who now have a history. You have working class neighborhoods that are built next to the coal mines. So it's not just, I was telling in the simplistic sense of the kind of technical aspect, but it's never just technical. That's the myth of the Andrew Yang narrative. So it's also that you have, I lived in Wales once, so I always picture the South Wales mining valleys. And you have these little villages of these tiny little 2-up, 2-down terraced houses. That's where the coal miners worked, because right over the hill is where they went. And you had civic institutions and political structures in those very towns that were connected to the fact that everyone who lived there was a worker, that you had at a certain point generations, sons of sons who were coal miners. So around all of that, you also have political issues that you can't just come in and say, we're getting rid of this union, we're getting rid of these workers, we're busing these folks in and they're going to dig the coal out of the mountain. Like, that would have disrupted the whole society, which is why it's not until the 1980s, way after the fuel source switches to oil, way after the central importance of coal has diminished, that's when Thatcher breaks the coal unions. But she's able to at that point because we're now dependent on oil, not coal. Coal is a much more minor thing. But if you were to go back to that time and think like the most malevolent, not inhuman capitalist, what can we do? Like, forget these workers. We want to have authoritarian political structures and get the coal out of the ground. You had all sorts of forces standing in your way, both the technical aspects of how you dig coal out of the ground, but the social and political structures that had grown up around that, you would have had riots. And of course you did, right? So what protects and defends these workers' rights is political mobilization. So you also had, the history of 18th and 19th century Britain is this history of economic growth. It's also a history of riots and working class organization. What happens later when you get to oil is that there aren't sites for the riot. You don't have the local town coming together because you have a pipeline going from here to there. You're getting oil from someplace else. You may not even be getting it. Many of these industrial centers may not even be getting the oil locally. They're getting it from a pipeline where it's someplace else entirely. And maybe what you have there is not a democratic system. So it may be, we can see that now, right? All sorts of the resources for capitalism that goes into rich Western countries that are ostensibly democratic are coming from places that are not democratic at all. Coal, you had this case where, you dug the coal in Britain.
Right. It's big, lumpy, it's hard to move and dark and gives off fumes when you truck it around the place.
And we didn't have the infrastructure that didn't get built around it, right? So the coal revolution gives you the steam revolution that gives you railroads, which means that later on you may have the railroads so that the next time around you can move it. But at that point we didn't. The technology feeds on itself, and at a certain point you get a technology that lets you get around these both technical blocks, but also the social and political ones.
Okay, so it's not going to be enough. I'm just going to take the next leap that you
sure.
sort of, pushed me off on. It's not we can't unionize. Like, we can't save white collar jobs by unionizing. We're not a choke point. We have no choke point. Again, like ChatGPT, if we had a choke point, ChatGPT just killed it.
Right.
Like, that ain't gonna work. It was a nifty idea to get the software engineer. I mean, like, which maybe gets us to my jumping off point. The software engineers, this thing can code.
Yeah.
I've been jumping up and down saying this thing. The reason I'm doing it, I'm repeating the thing I've already I've said to you. This thing can code, and I can talk to it. It understands me. I say, hey, can you write me a bash script that does this, and this? It gives me a bash script. I say, hey, one of these things is actually an array. Can you change this code? He says, okay, yeah, here it is. I've done several, like, I'm a software engineer in life. And the last several weeks, I've just, like, instead of going and Googling the thing and finding the answer on Stack Overflow, I ask ChatGPT to do it, and it does it. Just my grunt work that I have to look up, because I don't know anything off the top of my head anymore, and no one does. There are infinity languages, and like the days when we just wrote C for 20 years are long gone. All of the systems are changing. So, I mean, and that is the only drawback of ChatGPT for me, is its intelligence is about 2 years old. So Google, who keeps revving their SDK API, because you must keep revving the interface that you use to talk to their web services so that we have jobs. There it was.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT is a little bit behind that. I mean, it's just about perfect. But, like, my job as a software developer, where I knit stuff together, is coming to an end, and I have to move a level up. Like this, and this was my question. Okay, so here are the things I can think of that we can be: capitalists, scientists, and this is just, I'm just talking white collar now. Capitalists, scientists, administrator, aristocracy, right? I don't know. Do you want to take that? Does that?
Well, I want to ask a question about, I want to go back to because I think a lot of people are reading about or playing with ChatGPT, and I have done so less than others, but I've talked to a lot of others who have. So I want you to talk a little bit more about, and we have to, I don't know what name to use, right? Are you coding with ChatGPT? Is it an assistant for you doing your coding? Because the thing that has most wowed me in trying to learn about ChatGPT was when you sent me a transcript of the dialogue you have with ChatGPT. And it blew my mind because, as you just said, you asked it questions, but of course, the way it answers you is a little different than, for example, my friend who teaches poetry, who asked it to write an essay about a poem, and we were thinking about it the way a student was. And And it was a crappy poem because ChatGPT doesn't understand how to interpret meaning, or so it seems to me. Or people who are asking it sort of technical questions, but that they really come down to a sophisticated Google search, which we all know how to do. So the thing that struck me is that on the one hand, you could see that, and I guess this is a question for you, is one perspective is this was a very sophisticated Google query answer. The other is this was a very rudimentary, like perhaps apprentice-like coworker who you said, go write this code, because what ChatGPT produced for you was not just knowledge or information. And this gets back to the broad theme here. It produced work. It didn't just answer, it wrote code. It didn't say this is a fact in the world. I've looked it up on Wikipedia. It said, you want a program that does this? Here is a program that does this. And at places in your job, what your employer is employing you to do is write code that does something. So you're asking ChatGPT not to help you, you're asking ChatGPT to do your work. So it was very clear to me. For one thing, I'm not a software developer. I do not know how to code. I have this much knowledge of coding, kind of like my knowledge of Spanish. And yet I had enough that I could read your transcript and go, oh, if I had no other choice because higher education is failing and I lost my job, if I had ChatGPT and could really fake a job interview and someone assigned me a task of writing code, I could probably get it done because I had enough of a language to ask ChatGPT. I could understand the questions you asked. And that was enough, right? Being able to ask the questions, man. And then when it gave you output, I was like, oh, yeah, I see that. And I could ask it more about that. So I guess, how is it producing, to what extent is it producing work? And I would like people to hear more about that, because that's really transformative for me.
Okay, so here's what it is. I think of it as you have made English, spoken English, into a programming language. That's what ChatGPT has done for me. So like you said, yeah, I understand this because you in fact, you totally lied. You have taken a coding class, you have an app on the App Store. Like you absolutely can code. You also know about code, like the meta things of code. Like, what do I do with code? Oh, I turn on computers. I write files. I move files from one place to another. I present data. I transform data. Now, if you understand the tasks of code, if you use them, you can code with English. And I said, if I os.opened, and I said os.opend, and then apostrophe D, like total idiom that I just made up on the spot. And it like did not waver its understanding at all. It absolutely understood what I said. And that, I just keep having moments like that.
Because it does that all the time, right? Its ability to understand you in the language of code. Yeah.
It understands me in the language of English that I speak, which has like 18 likes in it. If you haven't noticed from everyone, if you haven't noticed from like this conversation, lots of swearing. Like I just talked to, I type like this as well. It totally understands me. I compared it to Rancière, which you've told me about, and I'm like, I don't know if that's true, but it is demonstrated.
Well, I think that's. The other thing that I think came out of our conversations when we decided that I guess there's, to overly simplify, right? There's two sides of what we wanted to talk about. One is that don't mistake ChatGPT for all of the other earlier claims that because this is a technology that makes humans more productive, there won't be any jobs anymore, or this will automatically end capitalism. It's either side, right? This will end capitalism because there won't be any jobs anymore, and that will lead to the revolution. Or this will end capitalism because now we'll be able to produce enough goods, food, clothing, and shelter for the whole human population that we won't need this anymore. Those two theses have been advanced since at least the 19th century, and they are always false. There is no inherent reason that capitalism is going to collapse on itself. And there is also, I think the second one's maybe even more important, it was a long, long time ago that we had the technological ability to feed, clothe, and shelter the globe. And yet what we continue to do is increase inequality across the globe. So we know that neither of those things are going to work. So that's kind of side one. Don't mistake it for that. But I think side two, the best way I know of describing it is that there is something about ChatGPT that is important. And to the extent that you and I have been able to put a name on it, it has something to do with dialogue. That is, we've just described what was significant about it for you, which is that you communicate with it. You tell it to do things and it spits them back at you. You follow up on them. You create idiomatic expressions, making a verb out of a code word, and ChatGPT doesn't blink. And what impressed me was when you sent me a copy of the dialogue. This stands in contrast to those folks who are trying to assign ChatGPT a single task, like write me a student essay, and it doesn't do it very well. But even there, people have found that if you want ChatGPT to do something good, you iterate. And iteration, I know iterate is the cool word these days, but iteration is just another word for dialogue, right? Like you say it to do something and it does something, and you say, well, could you do it this way? And whether you like it or not, and this also gets, I think, to the aspects of to what extent is this thing human intelligence? What would it mean for it to be sentient? All those things, is that you're having a conversation with it. But iteration is not like you iterate with a hammer over and over again. It comes back to you in a different way, and you keep changing, and that's what dialogue is. That's the that goes back a really long way.
That goes really back and forward a really long way. Like that is, I mean, computability. Like it's the difference between like a Turing machine and you and me.
Right.
That we poke each other. And you and I have this relationship like really a lot at this point. Like outside of this, it is our dialogue, right? We are doing things. We are doing our own projects, but in dialogue with each other. So like, you're writing books and I'm writing articles for you to cite, and I'm making an album, and you are, I keep bouncing shit off of you, like whenever I, need you. And you are like, are always pretending that you are not a musician, but no, you are perfect for this task because you are an audiophile, you like my music, and you will tell me when I'm doing something wrong.
Right.
So
well, there's something there. So the note I have there is poke, which I don't know if it predates Facebook's initial use of it, right? But there is something about the temporality of our digital world where we have dialogues in a different way now. So what you've inspired me to do is to want to say more about dialogue, in the sense that the initial thing would be like, oh, let's go back to European civilization, Socrates, right? The Socratic elenchus is the dialogic model in which you talk face to face with others. And I actually want to be clear that I don't think that's actually at all what we mean by dialogue. Because part of our dialogic practice, like this thing here is a total exception. It involved planning in advance. We're going to Zoom at a particular time and record it for this kind of exterior thing. Instead, there is a set of work practices and artistic creation that we each have that are somehow linked through a dialogue that really is like, you send me 3 things that are pokes, that or are like little objects of creation, and then the temporality with which I might respond to them is totally unpredictable, right? Like sometimes they just sit there, sometimes there's an immediate response, and then sometimes there's like one of us is digesting the thing because it involves reading something or listening to something, and you don't even know, right? So Zach Bryan is an example, right? Like I said, listen to Zach Bryan because, oh my God, he moved me. This is artistic output that is significant. I thought that you would understand it. And then I got really busy and you got really busy, and neither of us talked about Zach Bryan for 3 weeks. And then you sent me a song and it was awesome. And I described you that it was awesome. And as you said, I don't always do that. Sometimes I say like, this is good, but that. And this song, I'm just like, and then this one was like, no, this is awesome. And you were like, yeah. And it didn't even occur to me, I've been listening to Zach Bryan. So there's something about the temporality of a back and forth that is a dialogical movement, but it's not this, we must be present all the time. And ChatGPT is off. I mean, it's code. It can create code. So the way in which you're interacting with it bears some resemblances to the way that we, and it's not just me and you, right? All sorts of people have this, right? They have message threads with people in various ways. And it doesn't even have to be 2, right? People are on family WhatsApp threads of 8 people. And that is this space of communication. I imagine that some people who study linguistics and some ethnographers are writing about what this looks like. I'm not familiar with that literature, but it seems like we're talking to one another in a different way. Right. So it's significant that ChatGPT may be a part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the metaverse, right? This is like the thing that we keep getting called this virtual world, which is going to be full of bots and just suck. Like the thing where everybody's
that's right.
like, that's going to be the fucking worst. Don't go there. But like, this is the metaverse now. Like this thing that you are describing, that we are poking each other. And like, you know, I have this TikTok channel where I do Sudokus really fast. And I have like all of these people that I have never talked to, like 50,000 people watch me like do a Sudoku, which 50,000 people have never watched me do anything. Like, and it's right there. It's on your device and your phone, and that device might get smaller and more unobtrusive and more part of our integrated. But like, you want to go in the fucking virtual world, like you need to be a human. But yeah, like the asynchronous poking through via like and anyone, anywhere across the something. Is that a net good? I don't know. Like there seems like there's a lot of bad things about it too. And it's, as you say, like it hasn't helped us feed, clothe, house anybody, or deliver better medical care. It's worse than it's ever been. Like in the entire time I've lived in Seattle, it's never been worse.
Yeah. Well, we're weird. We're both super privileged, and therefore so in all sorts of ways, in material benefits, but it also means we're weird in terms of this thing that we're talking about poking and dialogue, and it, like, we don't live on social media, because it seems like, you know, what Facebook would like to have is like, no, there's just one space, you live here, or Instagram, you just live here, and you have to live in these terms, and you actually have to have the resources and time to work outside of that. I mean, it also makes me think a little bit about, it's interesting that it's called ChatGPT, right? Because it's for me, when this thing happens, it's in chat-like spaces. The students I talk to on Microsoft Teams chat, but those, in a weird way, right? Privileged spaces now are spaces where we're outside of the algorithm's attempts to sell us stuff. So if I can talk to my students on a Microsoft Teams chat thread, Facebook is not controlling that for their own aims. The same thing when you and I message on Apple Messages. And those spaces are becoming increasingly rare. And so right now it seems like people are having conversations with ChatGPT as that kind of chat. But I think we all know that they're going to want to make ChatGPT the kind of conversation you have on someone's Facebook message board, which is a horrible conversation, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. You blow my mind all the fucking time, but the one just there was like, oh my God, Facebook is a time-saving device. So you don't have to social media with all your friends individually. You can do it all at once.
That's right.
Like, or you don't have to talk to them. You can just put it out there. Anyway. I feel like I might want to stop it there because, you know, that, I know it didn't come full circle, but I think we hit it. It
came as close as we would, if we weren't intending to, and if we tried, we would miss the mark way more than we have now. So I think that's right. Okay, I'm going to hit the stop button here.